Welcome to our magical sleep journey. The black screen will help to get rid of unnecessary light so you can sleep better. If you have any suggestions for improvement, please write them in the comments. And now relax, close your eyes, and listen to this magical story from another dimension. In a quiet valley where sunlight painted the hills with gold and soft lavender, there lay a village that believed in wishes. Its streets were paved with cobblestones that glimmered faintly at dusk, and lanterns hung from tall curling poles, their warm glow whispering promises of magic to anyone who dared to listen. On the edge of this village, where fields gave way to an ancient forest, lived a young seamstress named Elira. Elira had nimble hands and a curious heart, and though she worked quietly in her little shop, her dreams soared far beyond the hills and rooftops. Every evening, when the village settled into the hush of twilight, she would sit by her window and sew by the light of a single star, one brighter than all the rest. She never knew why it gleamed so fiercely above her house, as if it had chosen her alone, but she smiled at it, and in return, it twinkled back like a friend keeping a promise. The forest beyond the fields was not an ordinary forest. It was said that when the wind moved through its branches just so, you could hear the trees sing, soft and low, like a lullaby from an unseen choir. Children whispered of creatures that lived there, gentle beings with fur like velvet dusk and eyes like falling comets. No one had ever truly seen them, though sometimes, on nights when the moon curved like a silver cradle, a soft glow could be spotted drifting between the trunks, as though lanterns floated untethered in the air. One night, as Elira finished a gown of deep sapphire silk, a strange sound called to her a low chime, like glass kissed by wind. She stepped to the door, and there, in the grass outside, was a single feather. It shimmered faintly, not white nor silver, but every color at once, shifting when she turned it. She picked it up, and warmth spread through her palm, gentle and unhurried, like sunlight through water. Without knowing why, she tucked it into her sewing bag, as though it belonged there, and stepped into the night. The forest path unfolded as if it had been waiting, the lantern glow of fireflies gathering to guide her. The deeper she walked, the more the world around her changed. The air shimmered like silk stretched thin, and flowers bloomed where her feet touched, their petals glowing faintly, fading only after she passed. The sound of the trees grew louder, forming harmonies that pulsed like a heartbeat. At the heart of the forest stood an oak so large it could have been the spine of the world itself, its branches stretching so far they carried their own horizon. At its base was a door, not carved by hands, but grown into place by time and wonder. Elira placed the feather against it, and the wood rippled, as if waking from sleep. The door opened without a sound, and she stepped inside. The space beyond was not dark, but filled with a light that moved like water, shifting between warm gold and soft blue. It was a hall, though no hall she had ever seen, for it stretched without walls, and yet felt entirely enclosed, as though the sky itself had leaned down to cradle it. Floating through the air were orbs of light, each one carrying a faint image within, a memory, a dream, a moment suspended. She reached toward one, and it glowed brighter, revealing a young girl spinning in a field of wildflowers, laughing, hands outstretched toward the sky. Another drifted by, showing a boy hugging an old dog under the rain, their joy brighter than the storm above. From the far end of the hall, a figure approached. It was not entirely human, nor entirely anything else, but a being woven of starlight and soft earth, with eyes that reflected every season all at once. It bowed slightly, its voice a melody and a whisper, like a flute played underwater. "Welcome, keeper of threads," it said. Elira, startled, looked behind her to see if someone else stood there, but the being's gaze never wavered. "You have mended more than cloth," it continued, "and the stars have taken notice." In its hands appeared a spindle, carved from crystal and faintly humming, threaded with a strand of light. "Take this," the being said, "and weave for us what has been broken." Elira took the spindle, feeling its weight. Though it was lighter than air, it carried a warmth, the same warmth as the feather. Suddenly she understood. The gown she had sewn, the delicate hems and carefully patched holes in villagers' clothing, it was all a practice for something greater. This was no ordinary thread. It was a thread of stories, of lives, of the unseen magic that held the world together. The being stepped aside, and before her appeared a loom, tall and shimmering, with strings made of pure moonlight. She hesitated, then sat before it. As her hands moved, instinct guiding her, images flowed from the threads, a mother finding her lost child, a bird taking flight after a broken wing, an old man smiling as forgotten laughter returned to his eyes. Every weave sparked small bursts of light that floated upward and vanished, leaving the hall warmer and brighter with each pass. When she finished, the spindle was empty, and the loom hummed softly, like it was thanking her. The being smiled, if light could smile, and said only, "The world remembers." Before she could speak, the hall faded, dissolving like mist. She found herself back at the edge of the forest, dawn brushing the sky in pale rose and gold. In her bag, the feathers still glowed faintly, and beside it rested the crystal spindle, now bound with a single golden thread. From that day on, Elira continued to sew, but her hands carried something different, something people could not name, but always felt, a softness in their hearts, an ease in their sleep, and sometimes dreams filled with glowing threads and endless skies. And every night, above her window, that same single star still burned, brighter than all the rest, as though keeping watch not just over her, but over every story she had ever mended. Years passed like pages turning in a quiet book, each one inked with threads of wonder no one fully understood, but everyone felt. The little village grew brighter, not in size, but in spirit. Laughter echoed more freely down the cobblestone streets, and even on days when storms rolled heavy and gray, there was a softness beneath it all, like the rain itself carried a secret kindness. The villagers began to notice something peculiar. Clothes stitched by Elira never wore thin, no matter how often they were used, and they always seemed to bring comfort to their wearers. A patched scarf given to a child would warm their hands and heart in winter. A mended sleeve on an old farmer's coat would lighten his step as if spring itself had sewn into the fabric. Whispers spread. Some said she was blessed by the stars. Others swore she had bargained with the old forest spirits. But no one questioned it too deeply, for her magic, whatever it was, seemed to bring only good. And each night, the bright star above her home glimmered as though keeping a secret only she and the heavens knew. One autumn evening, when leaves painted the ground in copper and honey, Elira found another feather at her doorstep. This one shimmered with deeper colors, as though twilight itself had woven into its fibers. With it came a strange stillness, as if the world was holding its breath. She knew, without knowing why, that the forest was calling again. Her feet carried her there almost of their own will, the path unfolding as it had years before, but this time the glow of fireflies was stronger, the songs of the trees more urgent. At the heart of the forest, she found the ancient oak again, the door waiting as though no time had passed. The spindle in her bag pulsed faintly, alive, eager. She pressed the twilight feather to the door, and it opened with a rush of warm air, as if welcoming an old friend home. Inside, the hall of light was changed. The orbs of memory floated faster, brighter, spinning as if stirred by unseen winds. But they were trembling, flickering at the edges. Some dimmed suddenly, winking out like candles in a storm. The being of starlight approached, its glow softer now, tinged with worry. "Something is unraveling," it said, voice low and heavy with meaning. "A thread beyond this world's edge has frayed, and if it is not rewoven, many lights will fade." Elira held the spindle tight, her chest rising with both fear and resolve. "Show me where," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet steady. The being extended a hand, and before her eyes, the hall stretched open, revealing a new door, one she had never seen before. Unlike the oaks, this one was woven entirely of starlight, shimmering faintly with an otherworldly hum. Stepping through it was like stepping through water and sky all at once. She found herself on a floating bridge of light, suspended in a place without horizon or ground. Around her stretched a vast expanse of broken threads, drifting in darkness, glowing faintly like dying embers. At the far end of the bridge was a loom, enormous and incomplete, its frame fractured, strands of thread trailing into nothingness. Elira walked carefully, the spindle in her hand resonating with the place itself, humming softly as though in greeting. The closer she came, the heavier the air felt, not from danger, but from sorrow. These threads were lives, dreams, and memories of a world perhaps far away, perhaps long ago. She set the spindle into the great loom, and as she touched the loose threads, images flared. A child looking up at a castle window, waiting for someone who never came, a bird's nest abandoned in stormy wind, an old musician sitting at a piano, hands trembling with forgotten melodies. Her heart ached, but she began to weave. Unlike before, this loom resisted at first, stiff and uncertain. So she sang not words, but a hum she had learned from the forest trees, the lullaby they had given her years ago. The loom responded, softening under her touch, the threads aligning. She wove until her arms trembled and her eyes blurred, weaving not just the broken threads she found, but her own hopes and memories into the tapestry. Her father's laugh on a spring morning, the warmth of her mother's hand, the night she first saw the single star above her home and felt, for the first time, that she belonged somewhere in this wide world. When she finished, light exploded outward, not blinding, but warm and endless. The broken threads glowed whole, the bridge beneath her brightened, and a soft wind rose, carrying the sound of distant bells. The sorrow that had weighed on the place lifted, like the final notes of a sad song giving way to silence. The being of starlight appeared at her side, its eyes bright with something like pride. "You have mended what even we could not," it said softly. "But this work is not yet done. There are more worlds, more threads." Before she could answer, the world tilted gently, and she was standing again at the edge of the forest, dawn crowning the hills in soft amber. The twilight feather in her hand had changed. It was now golden, warm like the morning sun. And on the horizon, beyond the fields and village, a castle shimmered faintly, as though a dream had just begun to take shape in waking life. The castle shimmered faintly on the horizon, a silhouette spun from light and distance. So far it seemed more like a memory than a place of stone and wood. Yet something about it called gently, like a melody half remembered in the quiet of sleep. Elira knew this was no ordinary structure. Castles of this kind did not appear suddenly at the edge of the world. Days passed, though she barely remembered them. Her hands worked tirelessly at her sewing table, but her heart drifted toward the vision beyond the hills. The villagers noticed her quietness, how she would often pause mid-stitch, gaze soft and far away, before shaking herself and smiling as though nothing were amiss. But at night, when the star above her home burned bright and steady, she would stand at her window and feel a whisper brush through her mind. Come. One evening, as twilight melted into velvet darkness, Elira gathered her sewing bag and the golden feather, now bound to the crystal spindle like a delicate charm. She left no note, none was needed, for something told her she would return, though not quite as the same person who had left. The path to the castle was unknown to anyone else, yet her feet found it easily, as though it had always been there, hidden just beneath the folds of the familiar world. The journey began through meadows where fireflies glowed like constellations reborn in miniature, hovering and dancing ahead of her steps. As she neared the hills, the air shifted, growing richer and more resonant, as though it held a harmony only the heart could hear. When she reached the final rise, the castle stood clearly before her. It was not stone but crystal, every spire refracting the light of stars above, bending them into ribbons of color that swept across the ground like moving auroras. A soft bridge of glass stretched from where she stood to the gates, and though there were no guards, no chains, and no drawbridge, she sensed this was not an abandoned place. It was waiting. As she stepped onto the bridge, the crystal beneath her feet sang, an actual sound, faint but distinct, like chimes tuned to her every step. The gates opened with a sigh, and she entered into a vast hall so luminous it felt like stepping into the inside of a dream. Walls rippled faintly as though carved from living light, and in their depths moved shadowy figures, not threatening, but like memories playing across glass. At the center of the hall stood a figure, tall and cloaked in silver fabric that shimmered as if spun from dawn itself. Where its face should have been was a mask of mirrored crystal, reflecting Elira's startled expression back at her. In its hands was a spindle similar to hers, but ancient, worn at the edges, its thread frayed and sparse. "You carry the key," the figure said, voice like water cascading over stones, soft but impossible to ignore. "The golden feather. The world beyond ours is breaking again, not from sorrow this time, but from forgetting. Threads are fading because they have no keepers, no hands to weave them whole." Elira held her spindle tight. "You mean, dreams are vanishing?" "Not just dreams," the figure replied. "Memories, hopes, the quiet truths that hold hearts together. This castle stands at the crossroads of all that is remembered and all that is lost." It stepped closer, holding out its frayed spindle. "Will you help us restore what has been forgotten?" Something stirred inside her, a memory of the loom in the endless bridge space, the way it had felt to weave not fabric, but life itself. She nodded without hesitation. The figure bowed, then led her deeper into the castle. They entered a chamber vast and open to the sky, where threads floated freely, unbound and glowing faintly like embers before rain. A great loom waited at its center, larger even than the one she had seen before, and yet many of its strings were snapped or missing entirely. Beside it, hundreds of spindles lay idle, each carved differently, each bearing the faint warmth of hands long gone. The figure gestured. The loom awaits a new keeper. It is not just thread you must weave, but stories, connections, even forgotten songs. Each thread you place will restore something once lost. Elira stepped forward, hands trembling, and set her spindle into place. The loom responded instantly, glowing faintly as if waking from a long slumber. When she touched the first loose thread, an image sprang to life, a child on a shoreline, holding a paper boat and looking for someone who never arrived. Another thread revealed an old painter who had forgotten his own name, but still dreamed in colors too bright for the waking world. She began to weave again. This time it was harder. The threads resisted, curling and twisting, not from sorrow, but from absence. They had no anchor in memory, no story to hold them steady. So she did the only thing she could. She gave them pieces of herself. She sang softly, not the forest lullaby this time, but a song from her own childhood, a tune her mother had sung when storms rattled the roof and little Elira had been afraid. Her hands moved in rhythm with the melody, and one by one, the threads softened and obeyed, weaving into a tapestry brighter than anything she had ever seen. As she worked, the chamber changed. The floating threads began to hum, aligning themselves with hers, weaving on their own, as though she had reminded them how. The tapestry glowed brighter and brighter until the entire castle pulsed with its light, sending ribbons of color outward into the night, across fields, across forests, beyond even her own village, to places she had never seen but somehow felt connected to. When at last she stopped, her body weak but her heart full, the figure stepped forward and bowed deeply. "You are no longer merely a keeper of threads," it said softly. "You are a weaver of worlds." The golden feather at her spindle dissolved into light, sinking into her hands, leaving behind a warmth that would never fade. For the first time, Elira understood that her work was far from over. There would always be threads to mend, always forgotten hopes to restore, always stories needing a home. And above the crystal castle, a new star appeared, bright and steadfast, mirroring the one that had once hung alone above her little shop window, a sign, perhaps, that her own story had only just begun. Elira walked back toward the village under the newborn star, its light following her like a loyal companion. The crystal bridge of the castle dissolved behind her as she stepped off it, fading into the mist of dawn as if it had never been there. Yet she knew it was not gone. Only waiting, like a heartbeat slowed but never stilled. The hills rolled quiet, morning dew glistening like tiny mirrors. When she reached the first familiar path near her village, she paused. It felt smaller than before, not lesser, but gentler, as though time here moved differently than in the luminous halls she had left behind. She stepped into the square, where the baker was setting fresh loaves on his wooden counter, and a child chased a chicken, laughing too loudly for the hour. The world was the same, and yet she was not. The villagers greeted her, their eyes soft with warmth, but carrying unspoken curiosity. They noticed the new way she carried herself, like one who had seen great storms and quiet miracles alike. Even her sewing bag glowed faintly now, the crystal spindle peeking out from its folds, alive with a gentle hum. She returned to her little shop, its walls the same shade of soft cream, its wooden counters smooth from years of her hands passing over them. But something in the air had changed. As she opened the windows and let sunlight spill in, the golden warmth felt fuller, like even the light had been mended. She sat at her work table and touched a simple patch of fabric, preparing to mend a child's torn jacket. When her needle touched the thread, she felt a spark, and a soft vision passed before her eyes. The child wearing the jacket years later, laughing on a riverbank with a friend he had not yet met. Her breath caught. She smiled faintly, whispering, "So it begins." In the days that followed, whispers spread again, faster this time. The clothes she mended not only lasted longer, they seemed to remember. A young woman given one of Elira's gowns claimed she danced better when wearing it, as if guided by music she couldn't hear. An old man whose boots had been patched by Elira swore they carried him farther than his tired legs should have allowed, taking him to visit an old friend he'd thought he'd never see again. Even the quiet, broken-hearted widow who had stopped smiling since her husband's passing began to hum again, a tune she didn't know she remembered, when she wore the scarf Elira had repaired for her. And then, strange things began happening in the village itself. The cobblestones in front of Elira's shop sometimes glimmered faintly at dusk, even when no lanterns were lit. The old fountain at the square's center, long dry, began to flow again, not with water, but with tiny lights that floated upward before fading into nothingness. People said it was because the threads of the village itself had been mended, though few understood what that truly meant. One night, as Elira sat by her window under her familiar star, she felt the softest shift of air behind her, as though someone had stepped into the room without opening the door. She turned and saw the being of Starlight standing there, though smaller this time, shaped more like a person than a constellation. "You are changing more than you realize," it said softly, its voice carrying both pride and concern. "The weaving has begun to flow through you, out into the waking world. This village is healing, but it will draw eyes. Not all eyes will be kind." Elira held her spindle, which hummed faintly in her hand. "What should I do?" The being smiled, if such light could smile, and simply said, "Keep weaving. Whatever comes, your threads will hold." And with that, it vanished, leaving behind the faint scent of warm earth after rain. The days ahead unfolded like the fabric she worked with, some smooth, some tangled. One morning, travelers arrived, drawn by stories of a weaver whose stitches carried luck and dreams. A prince from a far-off coast came with a cloak torn on a perilous journey. A merchant brought silk frayed beyond repair, hoping for restoration. And among them, there were whispers of darker things, strangers seeking her not to mend, but to own what she carried, the golden gift of weaving life into thread. Elira stood at the threshold of her quiet shop, the spindle warm in her hand, feeling the world beyond her little village opening like the loom's endless sky once had. She knew the life she had lived before, quiet and unseen, was no longer hers. She had become something else, part seamstress, part guardian, part storyteller, holding together the fragile threads of many lives. And above her home, now, there were two bright stars instead of one. And so, under the gaze of two steadfast stars, the village slept in warmth and quiet magic, unaware of how close its threads had come to unraveling and how a simple weaver had quietly tied them whole again. Elira sat by her window, spindle resting softly in her lap, and breathed in the stillness. The winds carried no whispers of danger tonight, only the gentle hum of life continuing, mended and strong. She smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because it was woven. The world would always fray, and there would always be hands like hers to weave it whole again. And somewhere, deep in the folds of sky and story, the crystal castle waited, watching, shining softly, knowing that the keeper of threads had found her place. The stars above burn brighter, as if promising to remember. The end.